It's a Saturday afternoon in 1987. A boy, maybe 13, is in the garage with his father. Not talking. Just working. The old man is underneath a Ford pickup that's been leaking oil for 3 weeks, and the boy is handing him tools, not because he was asked, but because he figured out the pattern. Wrench. Rag. Wrench again. Nobody says, "Good job." Nobody explains what they're fixing or why. But somewhere in that silence, something gets transferred. A way of being in the world. A way of solving problems without making noise about it. A way of standing in a room and reading it, knowing what needs to be done before anyone speaks. That boy is probably somewhere in his 50s now. Maybe that's you. And here's what's interesting about that man. He grew up. He learned. He built things, fixed things, lost things, and kept going. He became someone his friends could depend on, even if they couldn't fully describe him. He developed a set of instincts so practiced they became invisible, even to himself. But somewhere along the way, the world started sending him a different message. It told him he was too quiet. Too closed off. Too slow to share. Too reluctant to process. Too unwilling to perform the kind of emotional availability that got rewarded in magazines, talk shows, and eventually, comment sections. And so a part of him went underground. Not because it died. Not because he chose to bury it. But because he understood, correctly, that certain things only survive when they're protected from the weather. Carl Jung called this the shadow. Not the dark side of a person. Not the villain hiding underneath the hero. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is simply the part of the self that doesn't get to come to the table. The parts that were handed back to you at the door. The traits that were useful, real, and yours, but that the people around you couldn't accommodate. For a lot of GenX men, the shadow isn't anger or cruelty or anything sinister. It's competence that was called arrogance. It's silence that was called coldness. It's self-reliance that was called emotional unavailability. It's a low tolerance for nonsense that got labeled aggression. It's the refusal to perform warmth you didn't feel, which the world decided was proof that you felt nothing at all. None of that is darkness. That's personality. And over the course of a lifetime, this man learned to dim it, not because he was broken, but because dimming it was the price of functioning in a world that wasn't built around people like him. But here's the thing about what gets suppressed. It doesn't disappear. It waits. And the men who spent 40, 50, 60 years carrying a version of themselves that the world tried to edit, those men have something now that most people will never develop. They have depth that was forged under pressure. And that changes everything. To understand where this begins, you have to go back to the specific decade that shaped these men. Gen X grew up in a particular kind of atmosphere. Not the post-war optimism of the boomers. Not the curated, connected coming of age of the millennials. Something harder to name. Something quieter and more ambiguous. These were the Latchkey years. The years when the divorce rate doubled, when both parents worked, when the television was on but nobody was really watching. When children came home to empty houses and learned, not from a book, not from a therapist, not from a YouTube video, but from the particular silence of an empty kitchen at 3:30 in the afternoon, that they were going to have to figure some things out on their own. And they did. That's not trauma framing. That's not a wound narrative. That is simply what happened, and what happened produced something real. A generation of men who learned early that waiting for rescue was a losing strategy. Who learned that competence was more reliable than connection. Who learned that if you wanted something done, emotionally, practically, professionally, you were probably going to have to be the one who did it. Maybe you remember that feeling. The particular self-sufficiency of a kid who stopped expecting someone to show up and started becoming someone who showed up for himself. That orientation doesn't vanish when you turn 30. Or 40. Or 55. It becomes architecture. But here's where it gets complicated. The same decade that built these men also began, quietly at first and then loudly, to tell them that everything they'd built was the wrong shape. The 1990s brought a new cultural conversation about emotional intelligence, vulnerability, and the dangers of the strong, silent type. The archetype that had been coded as reliable and respected, the man who handled his business without complaint, began to be recoded as damaged. Not wrong to be strong, but suspicious. Not wrong to be quiet, but probably hiding something. And the men who had spent their formative years learning to carry weight without making noise about it found themselves in a strange position. The very skills they had developed to survive, to provide, to function, were now being described as symptoms. That created something in a lot of these men that never fully resolved. Not bitterness, exactly. More like a permanent internal shrug. A decision, made below the level of conscious thought, that the cultural conversation simply wasn't talking about them. That it was for someone else. That the best thing to do was what they'd always done: keep moving, keep building, keep the internal weather private. Which they did. Psychologists who study emotional suppression have found something important about this pattern. It isn't simply repression in the Freudian sense. It's closer to what researchers call emotional compartmentalization, the practiced ability to separate inner experience from outer function. And in moderate amounts, it is genuinely adaptive. It allows a man to change a tire in the rain without spiraling. To sit with a dying parent without falling apart in the waiting room. To absorb a professional failure on a Monday and still show up on Tuesday. That's not numbness. That's a form of psychological endurance that most people only discover they don't have when they actually need it. But let's go deeper than coping mechanisms. Because what happened to these men wasn't just a story about learning to endure. It was a story about identity formation under unusual conditions. And to understand what that produced, you have to understand something about the way personality actually develops in human beings. Most psychological frameworks agree on this. Who you become is not just a product of what happened to you. It's a product of what you did with what happened to you. The choices, conscious and unconscious, that you made about which parts of yourself to keep, which parts to put away, and which parts to defend at all costs. For a lot of Gen X men, the parts they kept were the parts that worked. Problem solving. Observation. Patience. A certain kind of dark humor that processed difficulty without dramatizing it. An ability to read rooms, read people, read situations, quickly and quietly, without announcing the analysis. These aren't random traits. They are the specific psychological byproducts of growing up in an environment where attunement was necessary but expressiveness was not particularly rewarded. Where you learn to notice everything and comment on very little. There's a name in developmental psychology for the environment that tends to produce this kind of person. It's called a low-warmth, high-competence household. Not abusive. Not neglectful, necessarily. Just functional. Efficient. A place where things got done and feelings were handled privately. Research from attachment theory suggests that children raised in these environments often develop what's called a dismissing avoidant attachment style. The clinical language makes it sound like damage. And in extreme forms, it can be. But in moderate form, which describes most of the men watching this video, it produces something that the clinical literature often undersells. It produces self-containment. The ability to regulate your own emotional state without requiring an audience. The ability to be alone without being lonely. The ability to function in high-pressure situations because you've been quietly rehearsing emotional independence since childhood. That is not a disorder. That is a skill set. And it's a skill set that most of the modern world is desperately trying to develop, through meditation apps, Stoicism podcasts, therapy, breathwork, and about 47 different self-help books. While the men who already have it are sitting quietly in their garages, wondering what all the noise is about. But here's where it gets complicated again. Because the shadow doesn't only contain strengths. Jung was clear about this. The parts of yourself that get suppressed don't stay clean and organized. They accumulate. They develop weight. They start to influence behavior in ways that aren't always visible from the inside. The man who learned early to keep his interior life private didn't just suppress the parts the world rejected. Over time, he may have started suppressing things he actually needed. Things that weren't unwanted by anyone else, but that got caught in the same current, pulled under by habit. The tenderness that had nowhere to go. The ambition that got quiet after enough disappointments. The curiosity that slowly stopped announcing itself. The grief that got filed away so efficiently that one day he reached for it, at a funeral, at a milestone, in a moment that earned it, and found the drawer harder to open than he expected. This is the hidden cost that almost nobody talks about when they discuss male stoicism. Not that these men are broken. Not that they're dangerous. But that the very system they built to protect themselves can, without maintenance, begin to protect them from things they actually want. And the tragedy isn't that they suppressed the wrong things. The tragedy is that the mechanism became so automatic, so practiced, so efficient, that it started running without supervision. There's a study worth knowing about here. In 2013, researchers at the University of Texas conducted a series of experiments on what they called emotional labor in men across different age cohorts. What they found wasn't that older men felt less. The emotional responses, measured physiologically, were comparable across age groups. What differed was the gap between what was felt and what was expressed. And that gap, in men over 40, was significantly wider. The researchers weren't describing pathology. They were describing adaptation. A learned, practiced, decades-long habit of processing experience internally before, or instead of, externalizing it. Which raises a question that most studies don't bother to ask. What happens to everything that goes into that gap? Because it doesn't vanish. Emotion that isn't expressed doesn't evaporate. It transforms. Sometimes into physical tension. Sometimes into a low-grade, sourceless irritability that arrives on Sunday evenings for no apparent reason. Sometimes into a kind of philosophical distance, a man who watches his own life from slightly outside it, as though he is both the participant and the documentarian. You've probably felt that. The strange sensation of being present in your own life and simultaneously removed from it. Standing at your own kitchen counter, coffee in hand, watching yourself go through the motions with a kind of calm detachment that feels like peace but sometimes isn't quite. That's not depression, necessarily. That's what years of efficient emotional processing can look like from the inside. And here's what makes this generation particularly interesting. Because Gen X men didn't just develop this pattern in isolation. They developed it inside a specific cultural moment, the last generation to grow up before the internet, before the quantified self, before the era of radical transparency where everyone was encouraged to perform their interior life in public. They remember a world where privacy was normal. Where not everything needed to be shared, processed, uploaded, or discussed. Where a man could have an entire rich interior landscape, opinions, observations, private joys, unspoken losses, and that was simply called a personality, not a red flag. That world shaped something in these men that is genuinely rare now. A tolerance for ambiguity. A comfort with not knowing. An ability to sit with unresolved things without needing to immediately fix, post, or talk them into a shape that other people can engage with. In contemplative traditions, this quality has been prized for centuries. Buddhist monks spend years trying to develop what these men stumbled into through circumstance. The ability to be with experience without immediately narrating it. But here's where it gets complicated one more time. Because there's a meaningful difference between chosen silence and habitual silence. Between the man who is quiet because he has learned to listen deeply, and the man who is quiet because somewhere along the way he forgot that speaking was also an option. Between solitude as a conscious orientation, a deliberate relationship with one's own inner life, and solitude as a default that hardened into a wall so gradually that he never noticed the door closing. Both men look the same from the outside. They sit in the same chairs, drive the same trucks, keep the same routines, drink their coffee the same way, with the same economy of motion, the same absence of complaint. But internally, one of them is whole. And the other is waiting, without quite knowing what for. The question is never whether you became quiet. The question is whether the quiet is working for you, or whether you are working for the quiet. And most men in this generation have never been asked that question directly. Not by a parent. Not by a partner. Not by a friend, because the friends are often the same type, and men like this don't tend to ask each other things that don't have obvious answers. So they carry it. Competently. Reliably. Without complaint. The way they were built to carry everything, and yet. Despite all of that, despite the suppression, the compartmentalization, the decades of carrying weight that was never distributed, something remarkable tends to happen to these men in their 50s and 60s. They come into themselves. Not loudly. Not with a declaration or a reinvention or a sports car and a second wife. That's the boomer midlife crisis narrative, and it never really applied to this generation anyway. Gen X men don't tend to perform their transitions. They tend to simply arrive at them. Quietly. Without announcement. The way they've always done most things. But the arrival is real. There is something that happens to a man who has spent 40 years building internal architecture, weathering difficulty without collapsing, and slowly, through accumulated experience, understanding exactly who he is and what he will and will not tolerate. Something settles. The noise that used to reach him, other people's opinions, social pressure, the ambient anxiety of needing to be more or different or better, it loses volume. Not because he stopped caring about everything. Because he got precise about what actually deserves his attention. That's not apathy. That's discernment. And discernment, the refined ability to distinguish between what matters and what is simply loud, is one of the most undervalued forms of intelligence in contemporary culture. We live in a world optimized for reaction. For engagement. For the immediate emotional response. The man who has learned, through long practice, to pause between stimulus and response. To let the noise pass before deciding whether it deserves an answer, that man has a neurological and psychological advantage that no app can replicate. Research on what psychologists call ego integrity, a concept developed by Erik Erikson to describe the sense of wholeness and acceptance that ideally develops in later life, suggests that men who have processed difficulty without catastrophizing it tend to arrive at this stage with something that younger people often mistake for coldness. It's actually clarity. The capacity to see situations, people, and themselves without the distortion of unresolved need. Without the constant low hum of wanting to be perceived a certain way. Without the exhausting performance of an identity that was never fully authentic to begin with. These men have already failed. Already lost. Already been disappointed by people they trusted and institutions they believed in. And they survived it. Not because they were rescued. But because they were, and always had been, fundamentally self-sufficient at the level of the soul. That is the hidden strength that lives inside the shadow. Not the darkness. The depth. The kind of depth that only forms under sustained pressure. The kind that isn't available to people who were always comfortable, always affirmed, always swimming in warm water. It requires cold water. Requires resistance. Requires the specific kind of loneliness that teaches you to be good company for yourself. And these men are. Even the ones who would never use that language. Even the ones who would read that sentence and quietly set it aside without comment, which is itself the tell. The man who doesn't need to announce his depth is usually the one who actually has it. But here's the complication that can't be skipped. Because depth without expression is a library that no one else can enter. And that matters, not because these men owe anyone access to their interior lives. They don't. Privacy is a legitimate choice. Solitude is a legitimate orientation. Not every man is built for expansive connection, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of violence against personality. But there is a specific loneliness that can develop in very self-sufficient men. Not the loneliness of isolation, they can handle isolation. It's something more precise than that. It's the loneliness of being known only partially. Of having people in your life who love the version of you that shows up, reliable, capable, steady, but who have never been given the chance to know the version underneath. The one that notices things. That has opinions about art, or justice, or the particular quality of light on a Tuesday in October. The one that feels things deeply and files them away with such practiced efficiency that even the people closest to him can go years without realizing the filing is happening. That partial knowing is a quiet grief. And a lot of these men carry it without a name for it. So what do you do with all of this? Not in the self-help sense. Not the 7 steps, the morning routine, the journaling prompt. That's not what this is. But there are a few things worth sitting with. Quietly. The way men like this tend to sit with everything. The first is this: the shadow is not your enemy. The parts of you that went underground, the intensity that got called too much, the sensitivity that got armored over, the ambition that learned to stop announcing itself, those parts didn't go underground because they were wrong. They went underground because the surface wasn't safe for them. That's a distinction worth making. Because a lot of men in this generation have spent decades operating under a quiet, unexamined belief that the buried parts were buried for good reason. That the world's verdict on those parts was accurate. It wasn't. The world's verdict was a reflection of the world's limitations. Not yours. The second thing is harder. Integration, the Jungian term for making peace with the shadow, doesn't mean excavating everything and putting it on display. It doesn't mean becoming someone who talks more, shares more, performs more emotional availability than actually exists in him. It means acknowledging, privately if necessary, that the whole of you is legitimate. That the quiet is real. That the depth is real. That the things you noticed and never said, the feelings you processed and never expressed, the versions of yourself you protected by keeping them out of the weather, all of it is real, and all of it counts, even if the accounting was always internal. You don't have to show anyone the library. But it helps to know it's there. To walk through it occasionally. To stop treating your own interior life like a maintenance issue and start treating it like what it actually is. The most interesting thing about you. The third thing is the one that requires the most honesty. If there are people in your life who could know you better, who have earned it, who would receive it, who are waiting without knowing they're waiting, consider that letting them in is not weakness. It is the final form of the same self-sufficiency that built you. Because it takes more courage for a man like this to say, here is what I actually think, here is what I actually feel, here is who I actually am beneath the competence and the quiet, than it ever took to handle everything alone. Handling everything alone was practice. This is the real thing. There's an image that keeps returning when you think about men like this. A river that's been running underground. For years, decades, an entire lifetime in some cases, moving, carving, finding its way through rock and dark and resistance. Not visible. Not celebrated. Not mapped by anyone. But moving. Always moving. And then, at some point, sometimes in the 50s, sometimes the 60s, sometimes not until the very end, it surfaces. Not with drama. Not with flood or violence. Just a quiet appearance at the edge of a field somewhere. Clean water. Cold and clear and deeply, unmistakably real. That's you. That was always you. The world tried to bury it. The pressure tried to reroute it. The noise tried to make you forget it was even there. But water finds its way. It always does. And everything it passed through on the way to the surface, every layer of rock, every year of darkness, every silence that held more than it showed. That's not the story of a man who was diminished. That's the story of a man who was being made.